So welcome back to the Rhetoric Reviewed podcast. After a short month-long hiatus, we are back to making videos, and today I have a special topic for you. So for the last month or so, I've been exploring a little bit of libertarian ideas, especially when it comes to a bit more of the right-wing libertarian ideas, and I've had a lot of thoughts because recently, the last video I released was about, atheism and such, but it had a greater meaning, a deeper meaning when it comes to ideological consistency. And today we're going to discuss why this same issue with ideological consistency necessarily plagues libertarian ideas in a statist system. And we're talking about, again, the theoretical splits, but then also three specific issues, which are, I specifically have problems with, and, I think are cause for a lot of different splits. So let's begin. So what is libertarianism? Libertarianism is, without giving a dictionary definition, the idea that a government should be limited in its role and the free market should be, that market capitalism is basically the desired state of the economy. Now, to a certain degree, this is relatively true. America's original vision was, in a way, what we believe today as being libertarian, right? A limited government, a federal government, more localized governments, and a free market. But then, of course, as the Gilded Age came on and the expansion of federal power just kept on building and building, we've come to a kind of, what some people like calling like crony capitalism, but just a more statist system than what people like Jefferson may have imagined 200 years ago. So with that background, we have to understand a lot of the goals of libertarians, which are today to work within the system, of course, but to decrease the purview of especially legislation when it comes to creating unnecessary programs and departments. Some of these programs and departments are, the most targeted ones are things like the Department of Education and a lot of different sorts of welfare, which libertarians traditionally view as burdensome on not only the people, as a whole taxpayers, but burdensome on the people who are affected. And, this extends to other things, like whether or not the executive power should allow for, whatever Trump's been doing recently, honestly. The executive power, basically, executive privilege should be decreased. And the problem with this is that, the government has, as I said, it's gotten so large, right? Statism is now the status quo, that the government is everywhere, right? It's in infrastructure, it's in utilities, it's in housing, it's in development, it's in education, it's everywhere, right? I can go on and on giving individual program names, but ultimately the point I'm trying to get is that the government has a lot of different roles when it comes to impacting our day-to-day lives. And this also means equally there's, so many different ways we can cut down on government, right? So this is where the similar issue happens, right? We talked about in the last video why the atheist movement would never work out in the long term. It's because all beliefs, right, objective morality, if it does exist, then you need a way to prove it, which there isn't. And if morality is subjective, you need to be able to find out that ultimately, right, there is no actual basis for which to base morality. That's the problem we found with atheism, which is why I believe that natural law is, the best way to go about getting, the setting ground rules. And atheism, again, only works when the status quo is non-secular, just like how, libertarianism only works when the status quo is statist. And the problem I cited in the last video, the video before last, which I, of course, urge you to check out, is that because there are so many different aspects of morality, and, and the secular society does not claim to have a actual basis for, making decisions about morality, you're gonna have so many different factions and so many different, people who want to have different things and different standards and different levels of ideas when it comes to what constitutes basic morality, rights, all of these different things. And without an actual fundamental basis, that doesn't work. And same thing for libertarianism. There's some foundational pieces and some, popular thinkers, but there's no, other than a very few amount of principles, there's no consistency in there's no complete consistency, sorry, in what they believe should be considered to be, unnecessary government for them to actually form a cohesive unit. For example, one of the biggest splits is between the more, left and right-leaning libertarians, obviously, as the political compass would suggest. But a lot of that has to do with, for example, personal rights. What does the government have to do with personal rights? They only have to defend property rights, and right-wing libertarians would say no, they don't have to defend personal rights. They only have to defend property rights. Whereas some other groups would say otherwise, right? You have like the Mises Caucus. You have the I forgot their name. It's wow, huh? I had it down somewhere. Anyways, yeah, there's a lot of ideological splits, and I'm going to be talking about some of these issues now, which actually are the causes of some of these ideological splits. So, disparate impact is the first one, and if you're a little familiar with legal terminology, you would know what disparate impact is. For those of you who are not, who was including myself a few weeks ago, disparate impact is the idea that you can measure the impact of something based on disparate outcomes, which means that not necessarily on motive or cause, but on the outcomes themselves, and that they are disparate, that they have a disparity. And in America, this specifically pertains to the Civil Rights Act of 1965 because of the way it's enforced. And the libertarian argument is that the Civil Rights Act infringes on freedom of association, which is, I get to choose who I get to associate with. And that would include, right, for the outlooker, it could be by race, but to the person, you don't know whether or not exactly what they're thinking. So all right, all that to say, right, we know the Civil Rights Act did, it basically said, no more segregation, you can't do that anymore, and of course that didn't solve all the issues right away, but over the next 10, 15, 20 years, you saw a variety of different bills and laws being passed, which would say that in the workplace, and eventually, going back to the Kim Davis decision 2015, also, you can't discriminate based on any, innate characteristic of any person. The reason why libertarians don't like that, as far as I am aware, is because, again, it's restricting freedom, right? And, libertarian, right? And the argument is that the incentives aren't there to discriminate, because that means you are, especially in the markets, because you are losing out on potential customers. And therefore, it's, there's no incentive to actually discriminate, and that in the private life, the government doesn't belong there anyways. If you want to discriminate against people in your private life, go ahead, right? Which, even as someone living who has benefited, where everyone has benefited, honestly, from the Civil Rights Act, that's fair enough, right? You're not going to be able to, force someone in their brain to, not be racist or not have certain prejudices, and, everyone has their own. But when it comes to actual practice, when it comes to businesses and such, right, why would you ever deny a, very, very talented, let's say, black candidate over a barely qualified white candidate? That is the argument that a lot of libertarians put forward, because they are market focused. They believe that market incentives has the ability to fix for everything, because humans are naturally profit driven, especially when put into a capitalist system where their profit driven feelings can be maximized. And the problem the problem I have with this is that it doesn't really account for history or what's happening before, because yes, even if the whole thing about the market incentive being true for shop owners or employers, you have to deal with the fact that, in fact, before the Civil Rights Act, this was happening, right? Segregation was a thing. Jim Crow was a thing in America, despite the fact that, again, the laws of, the market incentives were always there. And people still chose to be discriminatory. And what that shows is not of, the nature of people or anything, but the fact that the market is not all powerful when it comes to this, to human praxeology, basically, right? Human decision making. And that's one of the things that I see personally as a big split as well, when it comes to what do we do about civil rights and what do we do about free association. So I guess on top of personal rights, free association is the other one, because my personal belief as someone who has, taken on all this information, is that despite, the obvious ideal is to reduce discrimination, but then again, I don't believe that the government should have a role in it. But in the absence of a government role in the past, we've seen that people naturally tend towards free association, which often ends up as separation by race. And then the second part of the libertarian argument, which I completely agree with, is the disparate impact principle, which is that any disparity can be used as legal grounds as proof of discrimination. For example, if Jim Bob hires out of 100 applicants, 70 are white, 30 are black, right? Or, let's use 85 to 15, that's disparate impact, right? You're seeing a disparity in outcomes. And therefore, you can, kind of pick at straws, of course, but you can easily allege that Jim Bob is using discriminatory hiring practices. Now, the obvious, rationally, you can see that this isn't the case necessarily. If you have a pool of, untalented, white applicants and very talented black applicants, then of course you could see that obviously. But when you're given, when you eliminate all sorts of context, it's very easy to say and very easy to attack people based off of this disparate impact standard, which is simply that based on this disparity, just because this person is hired more than this person, or this person makes more than this person, that there must be some sort of discrimination going on. That's not saying inequality doesn't exist, and there are some things that can be fixed. For example, you're going to find that because of educational attainment, there's going to be, on the whole, probably more white people getting employment than black people. But the very fact that is you cannot accuse someone of being discriminatory just because of disparate outcomes. And I guess that's one of the main problems that we see with the Civil Rights Act of 1965, is that the legal standard is sort of poor and crappy in the way that it kind of forces people to basically give up their freedom of association because this legal standard is so spotty. If you can actually prove, it's very difficult to prove, but if you can prove that someone is being discriminatory on their hiring practices or, business in general, then of course that would apply. But it's a bit loosey-goosey, and if you look at the numbers, the amount of people filing legal cases and claims skyrocketed with every single bill that came, not because of what it offered, but because of how easy it is to actually get the claim out. The next big problem I see is fraud, and not as in fraud as in like, oh, the SEC should be abolished because, they're kind of bad at their job, which they have been over history, and we don't know how many scams that are yet to be burst are going on right now. And of course, it comes to like politicians and all these different, exchange stuff. But the bigger thing is low versus high time preference idea. So low versus high time preference ideas being whether or not you're trying to get something in the short term done or in the long term. And I always forget which is which, because like low and high, low time preference meaning. I do believe it means, long term. Low time preference is long term goals, and a lot of libertarian ideas tend to be, pretty low time preference, because they want to get things done in the long term, because that's, you want to make sure that people are able to make the right decisions and such that progress can be continuous over time. The problem with this is, for example, I think the most evidence in fraud, where of course, a lot of libertarians try to reject, heavy, very strict monetary policy by the government, the SEC, and the government trying to dictate and having to, issue all these sorts of different things to different people for things that really didn't exist. And obviously, the SEC would likely be one of them. And the problem with this is that, of course, a lot of these frauds, especially the bigger ones, like the Madoff one and, Shkreli, right? These are, very, very costly scams that have occurred, but ultimately, if you look at these stories, it's not like these, Madoff was such a huge genius. I mean, he was to a certain degree, but it was a lot of individual oversight from companies and banks investing in him, and, this goes to, like, all different sorts of different scams, but a lot of it is individual oversight. And the low time preference idea is that scams, frauds, they will exist, obviously, and even more so and proliferate once you decrease the power and scope of the SEC or you abolish it, overall. And it's low time preference because it assumes that over time people will be more careful, more rigorous when it comes to dealing with how they're going to, make sure they're not being defrauded. For example, you're going to be making sure, doing the right background checks, doing the right scans, right? There will be companies who can offer that, perhaps, right? to offer that, to fix that need on in the private sector. And then slowly but surely over decades, people are going to be better at not getting scammed because they aren't going to fall for as much because they don't rely on the SEC to do their job anymore. And that's kind of the, I guess, the more right right-wing libertarian idea, where that we should be more careful that individual responsibility and accountability is much better than having the government step in, because the government isn't always going to do a good job, and having people reliant on the government is not going to be positive for their growth or even individual security in the cases where government is not able to intervene properly or in time. And I guess this is part of the reasons why, again, this answer to questions, why libertarians will never win, because this is such an unpopular idea. Low time preference policies have largely disappeared from politics for the last 80 years, because it's really hard to convince people that, like, okay, you're not going to get any benefits now. You're going to maybe even lose out now. Maybe you'll get defrauded now, but over time your progeny will be able to succeed. And people aren't looking for that, especially today when it comes, more and more people have become more and more high time preference, meaning that they are more driven by short-term goals. And this especially, again, applies to politics now, where people expect the politicians to do things now. Get things done now, improve my life now, even though that's not really possible a lot of the time. And that brings us to to breaking out of the status quo, why libertarians can never win, and how the incentives aren't there for anyone to vote libertarian, or how, politicians will never want to give up the power that they've accrued. This especially applies to people who have long tenures in, Congress and the Senate, because they're the ones responsible for upkeeping and writing bills that often just keep expanding the purview of the government. There's that one thing with Rand Paul in 2015 where we gave cocaine, we spent $500,000, which is for many people many years of salary, $500,000 on studying cocaine on sex drives of Japanese whale. It really happened. You can check it out on your own, but things like that, right? These are really things that we don't need, and a lot of this pork barrel spending, all it does is just perpetuate government spending and make sure that they're just able to get more and more each year because they quote unquote need it. And the other part of this is that the voters probably will likely not go along with this because, again, not only is there no unified libertarian party with any real support or following, there are so many different, pullings and different factions that are major in the Libertarian Party because they have, very foundationally different issues. One thing is the education issue. Do we get rid of do we get rid of the federally sponsored education system? Do we not? Do we do school vouchers? There's so many different ideas that it's very hard to find consistency across the nation such that libertarian ideas and principles can win. The next thing is that the system is already designed to keep people dependent on the government. All these different, of course, there's SNAP benefits, but there's the straight up benefits you get for being poor, right? And going across, screw the poverty trap, the welfare trap and such, which has been documented pretty well across history. Screw all of that. The very fact of these programs existing keeps people, invested in making sure they keep voting for the same politicians who promise to upkeep the system. And it makes sense. You don't want to blame. I don't want to blame people who are of low income, who are unable to, put food on the table, for not wanting to pursue low time preference things, right? For them, they need to get their needs met. They need to have high time preference to a certain degree, because if they don't, they're not going to be able to survive to next week, to next month, or even to the next day. And even though if it's not their fault, this means it's going to be very, very difficult to accrue a lot of that voter base, because there are so many other incentives that make sure that people want to keep a big government. For big contractors, for wealthy people, it's going to be tax benefits. Or I guess there's less tax, but it's going to be government benefits, making sure that they get the good contracts. And for the people at the very bottom, it's going to be making sure that they keep getting the government benefits they need. And again, low time preference will eventually make it so that there's going to be other forms of charity, other forms of social security that is not in the government or taxation department. And speaking of taxation, there's part of, some libertarians believe that taxation is theft, then some, libertarians are leading more classical liberal, where we need to have some taxation. There's all of these different things that need to be figured out, which, lead me only to believe that libertarians cannot win in the current American political climate, because it's going to be very difficult to convince people at the top, bottom, and even, in the middle, that government needs to get smaller and that services will be reduced, but instead that they need to sort of be more accountable and be more responsible with their own finances across all sorts of different things. And that all kind of stems from how much different libertarians are willing to do. Some people are even willing to, give up government infrastructure for crowdfunding. Personally, I think that's really stupid. I could see, why a lot of people wouldn't go along with that, because why would I pay when, like, Big Joe can pay next door, and then, everyone's like, oh, someone else will pay. And it's not, because it's not obligatory, nothing's gonna get done, and everyone has no roads, or they don't get repaired. So there wasn't really much of a flow to this video, and I do apologize, but this is sort of my collection of ideas on why I wish, it's not really that libertarianism is utopian, it's just that the incentives, which libertarians and market capitalists love so much, the incentives don't exist for either the voters or the politicians to willingly give up the government programs that they are currently a part of or the power that they have just to create, a possible better future decades down the line when they may not even benefit from that, change. So, if you have any thoughts, extra things, extra different, splits in the Libertarian Party, please leave it in the comment section down below. But otherwise, it's been Rhetoric Reviewed out.